Right around the world, our cities are battling rising sea levels, and they're turning to construction to help hold back the tide. We've rounded up some of the most impressive and important flood defence projects being built right now. So sit back, relax, and get ready for some epic engineering. If you were in Venice back in November 2022, you might have seen these glass barriers. They're protecting St Mark's Basilica from floods. It's a striking measure to combat the city's most pressing problem. It's sinking, and has been for years. But hold on a minute, if you've watched this channel before, you'll remember that Venice just spent decades building a $7 billion sea defence system that finally started working in 2020. Well, as this footage shows, that big expensive megaproject isn't turning out to be so mega. So what's the deal here? Why does Venice still need additional methods to protect parts of the city? And if a $7 billion system isn't enough to save it, what will? People travel from all over the world to see Venice's scenic canals and architecture, but the city may not be around to visit for much longer. In the worst case scenario, experts predict it could be underwater as early as 2100, as buildings sink further into the soil and climate change causes sea levels to rise. The city gets a lovely preview of that future every so often when a high tide known as Acqua Alta sweeps in. Now, Venice has pretty much always had to deal with this type of flooding, but in recent decades it's become much more frequent and intense, and the city is paying the price.
Venice, Italy is suffering its worst flooding in more than 50 years. At least 2 people have died.
These glass walls are just the latest step in Venice's long-running battle to hold back the ocean. You see, the place is essentially floating on water. It's built on top of a lagoon, and its foundation is mostly mud. The first settlers lived in houses made of wood and clay, both fairly lightweight materials. But as things expanded, better engineering tactics were needed. To create a stronger foundation, long wooden piles were driven into the ground until they reached hard clay 5 to 6 meters down. Each pile was closely placed together with rock packed in between, which prevented the silt from rising. From here, wooden platforms and stonework were placed on top. That worked for a time, but by the 16th and 17th centuries, the constant flow of sediment from the main rivers flowing into the lagoon had essentially turned it into a swamp. To solve that issue, engineers boldly diverted the rivers around the lagoon and straight out to sea. Just 100 years later, the barrier islands that divide Venice Lagoon from the Adriatic Sea were reinforced with a 10-kilometre seawall in an attempt to withstand storms. Then, following the devastation of the 1966 flood, the city installed a network of raised walkways 110 centimetres off the ground. What you're looking at here is the city's latest and most expensive flood defence system yet. A $7 billion mechanised barrier called Mose that promised salvation from a watery fate. After decades of controversy and planning, it finally began operating in 2020. Here's how it's supposed to work. A series of 20-metre wide metal barriers have been strategically placed around the lagoon's inlets. They sit in huge concrete caissons that were prefabricated on land, then dropped into trenches on the seabed. Each of these massive concrete segments features a service tunnel that all connects back to land, allowing access for inspections. When not in use, the hollow barriers are filled with water and submerged. But when a high tide is forecast, compressed air flows into the gates, pushing the water out. This causes the gates to rotate on their hinges and rise above the surface, blocking the incoming tide from entering the lagoon. Then, when water levels lower again, the gates fill back up and drop back beneath the surface, allowing ships to pass. Over the last few years, Mose has stopped a lot of potential flooding that would have previously washed out the city. But it has some drawbacks. First off, construction took ages. It was designed way back in the 1980s and was supposed to start working in the 2010s, but the system didn't go online for another decade. Since then, our understanding of climate change and its expected effects has evolved massively, and the forecasted scenarios that Mose was built for are now outdated. So parts of the city still see flooding, like St Mark's Square, which becomes a rather grand lake whenever the tide goes more than 80 centimetres above its regular level. Annoyingly for businesses and historic landmarks, city officials will only raise the Mosey system when the tide hits 110 centimetres, bringing in protection for about 86% of the city. If the threshold was lower, the gates would need to be closed 80 to 100 times a year, a frequency it isn't equipped to handle yet. That's why, despite a new $7 billion system, Venice still has to use glass barriers like this. They're 5 metres long, around 1.3 metres high, and stop rising tides from sweeping into famous buildings. Each one is fixed onto armoured concrete that extends 2 metres underground and works alongside a series of pumps and valves that prevent backup into the drainage system. When it's not flooding, there are openings within the walls, then when the tide hits, they're sealed off. It's only supposed to be a temporary measure until something more long-term is devised, and the walls and pumps can stop up to 1.1 metres of water, something Mosey isn't optimised to do yet. That's right, the $7 billion system can't keep up with these simple aquarium walls. So, having waded through all this context, you're probably wondering why they don't just lower the flood threshold and raise that big expensive Mosey thing more often. Well, brace yourself, because one of the big reasons they don't do that is that Mosey is not cheap to operate. Every time the barriers go up, it costs over $320,000, largely going on power and teams of people.
You have to send 80 people through the lagoon in order that they are just there in order to manually work on these machines in order to pump air in there and so on. So it's not just press of the button, but 80 people going out, staying there maybe for 2 days because they have bad weather situation, they cannot come back and so on. So this makes it so costly.
To be clear, Mosey isn't fully complete yet, and this cost will probably go down over time. It's technically still in experimental mode and is due to finish sometime in 2023. Eventually it could be optimised and run with a smaller crew, allowing it to be raised more often. But that doesn't necessarily mean they'll use it more.
Then remember, if you close the lagoon, there is no ships that can pass. So you don't have industrial ships, you don't have passenger ships, you don't have commercial ships like the fishery, the fisher boats. They cannot go out anymore or cannot come in anymore.
With 27% of the city's economy relying on these ships, pushing back the floods also means pushing away income from trade. The system does feature locks alongside its gates to allow some ships to pass, but it hugely impacts capacity. To make things worse, Mosey isn't a permanent fix. Jorg estimates the system might be pushed to its limit by around 2050 or 2060, depending on how quickly sea levels rise and how often they need to close the gates. He believes there are better, longer-term options that the city could take, like raising everything further above sea level by pumping water into underground wells.
There's geologists that were working on these kind of projects, and they showed that you can do something that you can raise Venice between 30 and 35 centimeters. 30 centimeters, just to make this clear, when we started to measure the sea level, at the end of the 19th century, we fixed the average water level at 0. So if you can raise Venice again by 30, 35 centimeters, you basically go back into the past by 120, 130, 140 years.
Raising land like this is something scientists have been considering for years, and it's been used in places like Taipei and Tokyo to mitigate sinking and store gas. But don't expect to see it in Venice anytime soon. Critics say that because the city injected so much money into the Mosey system, it's the one they'll have to run with, for now at least. Though that view might of course be forced to change should the waters truly come to threaten Venice's existence. This beautiful city has been in a battle with the very tides that enable its success for centuries, often engineering a way around the water and finding a path forward. But in a world that's now changing faster than ever before, it's realising that billions of dollars and glass sticking plasters simply aren't enough. The result is one of our planet's most breathtaking cultural landmarks being plunged into an increasingly desperate race for survival that it seems to be losing. It's raining again in China. None of us like the rain, but here it's gone from mild annoyance to a serious problem. Once a largely rural country, China now has more than 100 cities with populations of over 1 million people, and all that building on former farmland has led to a major downside: flooding. But instead of constructing big barriers like others have done, China is turning back to nature for the solution, upgrading its cities so that they welcome the water rather than hold it back. Get yourself comfortable and prepare to soak up China's sponge cities. China's home to more large cities than any other nation. 60% of its 1.4 billion citizens now reside in urban areas, and creating the space for them to live, work and play has meant replacing huge areas of green space with sprawling buildings and infrastructure. That's a lot of land that would have previously absorbed rainwater being replaced with surfaces that do the opposite, and all in a country that regularly experiences heavy storms. Little surprise then that flooding's become such a serious problem, even in places with good drainage. In 2020, over just 2 months, more than 400 rivers flooded across China, many of them worse than ever before, and at least 50 million people were impacted. On top of that, water shortages are occurring in some cities where water runs off the streets too quickly to enter water systems that are already overstretched. The response from China's government was to mop up this mess and convert many of these areas into so-called sponge cities. This is where areas are redesigned to cope with and process rainwater in a few different ways, soaking it up, storing it, and then releasing it when needed, a bit like, you guessed it, a sponge. Now, this usually involves combining what's known as grey and green infrastructure, so things like advanced drainage and water treatment systems, alongside natural and semi-natural areas. The US, Russia and India have all dabbled in sponge cities, but China's program is on an entirely different scale. Brace yourself for quite a few numbers. 16 cities were chosen to be part of the scheme when it launched in 2015, and another 14 joined a year later. The aim is to have 80% of these 30 cities absorbing and reusing 70% of rainwater by 2030. Hopefully you followed all that. That means massive changes to land use, surfaces, underground infrastructure and more across the world's most populated country. Although it sounds like a lot of work that needs to be done in not much time, this is China we're talking about, so of course they've already made huge progress. Chongqing, which has a population of over 16 million, can now rather grandly call itself one of China's leading sponge cities. Here, a new park in the Tongnang district helped the area quickly recover from the worst storm for 100 years in 2020. Up until 2019, just a small concrete barrier separated the Fu River from land that was becoming increasingly vulnerable to flooding. Now the barrier's gone, and when levels rise, water is free to flow into this incredible maze of constructed wetlands. Built over 99 hectares, it's an impressive network of native plants, trees, ponds, islands and elevated walkways, making it more than somewhere for excess water to go. People want to be there too, soaking up their surroundings. Chongqing was also the first sponge city to be given a smart digital control system, which lets authorities monitor its sewer and stormwater networks in real time. With this, they can control how water flows into the natural environment more precisely, analyse how well the whole system performs in extreme weather, and then use the data to prevent future floods. To the east of the country, on the banks of the Yangtze River, Zhenjiang has also gone big with sponges. As well as rain gardens and creeks that drain and retain rainwater, the city's been equipped with a system of bioswales, which stretch for several kilometres in total. These specially engineered channels with sloped sides funnel stormwater inside, where it filters down slowly into the ground beneath, often with debris and pollutants removed as part of the process. Go for a stroll in any decent sponge city and you'll also find permeable roads, paths and cycleways, all of which allow water to soak directly into the material instead of forcing it into drainage systems that can become quickly overwhelmed. Polyurethane binders are combined with gravel or stones to create a surface with similar properties to concrete or tar, but with tiny cavities that let water through. Around 4,000 litres of water per square metre can be absorbed each hour, and there are now networks of these across China, from Tian'an City to Hangzhou, which is set to host the 2022 Asian Games. Now, that event is actually relevant to this video because this site for the tournament was designed as one big Sponge City project, a fantastic place to soak up the sporting atmosphere. Previously a flat piece of land, the area is being transformed into a 116-acre eco-park spread across a rolling hillscape. Rainwater will be collected, filtered and reused for water features, plumbing, heating and cooling, according to Architectonics, which designed the master plan. But despite all this work, China's sponge cities haven't been able to prevent every flood from occurring, including one notable recent example. In July 2021, the city of Zhengzhou had almost a year's worth of rainfall in just 4 days, leading to extreme flooding that tragically killed hundreds of people. Zhengzhou spent over $7 billion upgrading hundreds of flood-prone areas, as well as the drainage system. Unfortunately, these improvements were completely overpowered, leading many to criticise the city's efforts and question the effectiveness of the entire programme. But Chinese officials responded by pointing out the severity of the storm, claiming that no city would have been able to avoid taking heavy flood damage in such a situation. Experts also say that sponge city projects are only really meant to protect against light to moderate storms and floods, which kind of brings us to the main point. Schemes like these do their job in most scenarios. There are loads of different options to suit a variety of cities, and they look great too. But with severe events like the one in Zhengzhou expected to become more common, we'll need more than this to stop further tragedies from occurring. Even with that said, for most cities worried about water levels, introducing a sponge strategy of their own or something similar is likely to put them on a much firmer footing in the future. This is Copenhagen, known for its beautiful waterways, cobbled streets, and for being one of the world's happiest cities, apparently. But despite the pleasantries, not everything's rosy in the Danish capital. According to authorities, the population is growing, but it's running out of room. And with sea levels on the rise around the old port city, flooding's also becoming a big concern. While many cities are facing similar issues and have come up with their own answers, some of them quite radical, the Danes like to do things differently, as we've seen before. Instead of separate projects to hold back the water and create new housing, Copenhagen is constructing an entire new island off its shoreline that it hopes will fix both of its problems. When you think of places that are vulnerable to rising sea levels and flooding, this little corner of Scandinavia might not immediately spring to mind. You're more likely to imagine cities like Jakarta, which is now sinking, or Venice with its aqua alta phenomenon that has tormented citizens and tourists for centuries. These aren't just well-known examples of cities with major water problems, they're also places that have come up with some of the most extreme ideas to solve their issues. Over in the Nordics, things aren't quite as bad, but there's still been a need to take drastic action. Made up of hundreds of islands, Denmark is a low-lying nation, and coastal areas like Copenhagen are already at risk of flooding in the event of a big storm surge. With sea levels set to rise by at least half a metre before the end of this century, and extreme weather becoming more common, the Danish capital now finds itself a bit exposed with little in the way of protection. The response is this: the construction of a massive artificial island. It was approved by MPs in June 2021 and is going to cost about $3 billion. Yes, land reclamation's always been part of Copenhagen's history, but it's nothing like what we're about to see here. Called Lynetteholm, the project involves adding 2.6 square kilometres of new land to the existing port area. That's about the size of 400 football pitches, and it's a task that's going to take around 50 years to complete. The perimeter of the island is going to be built with rock dams to help block storm surges coming in from the north, as well as reefs, sandy beaches, and a green coastal landscape on the east side. Now, because the seabed is very soft, a layer of it will need to be removed and replaced with sand before the dam material can be laid to ensure stability. The idea is to take a nature-first approach, meaning the land will be given time to become established with plants and wildlife before the main development begins.
Once finished, Lynetteholm will offer space for some 35,000 people to live and work, with a ring road, tunnels and metro station linking it all back to the rest of the city. To make all of this happen, some 80 million tonnes of soil gathered from other projects across the region will need to be transported here, with development company B1M leading the construction. It's a process that's being done in 2 phases, starting with the perimeter first to keep the water out and the land in, along with an access road and a facility where the soil will be weighed and checked. In the meantime, material has been placed in temporary landfill over on the North Harbour, ready to be shipped across to the Phase 1 area once it's ready. That's due to start in 2023 and take around 2 years, after which the remaining material will start getting trucked in from elsewhere in Greater Copenhagen. 2025 is also when the perimeter is due to finish, so by that point it'll already be offering surge protection. If all goes to plan with the rest of the project, then land reclamation will be all done by 2050. The developers really aren't kidding when they call it a long-term project. As for when you'll be able to see the island fully finished and populated, well, set your alarm for 2070. One reason for the lengthy time frame is the effort that's needed to get all that material to the site. An environmental assessment predicted that as many as 350 lorry loads would need to pass through Copenhagen every day to reach this target. That's in a city which is much smaller than most other European capitals and that already suffers from traffic congestion. Let's just say the reaction to this news from locals hasn't been overwhelmingly positive. But according to the developers' studies, using trucks is less carbon intensive than getting barges involved, like we've seen on similar projects. They also say the number of lorries shouldn't be too different to what's already being seen across Copenhagen, which has experienced a lot of construction over the past decade, including the extension of the North Harbour. But concerns about Lynetteholm aren't just limited to the roads. There's been opposition from environmental groups too, including one that's accused the project of greenwashing. They believe the environmental assessments weren't thorough enough, and even launched a lawsuit to try and stop it from happening. Others argue that the whole idea is just a bit overkill. They agree the city needs some form of flood defence, but that just an artificial reef or something similar would do the job much quicker, and wouldn't require nearly as much construction work or money. As for the housing pledge, again, not everyone's convinced it's what Copenhagen really needs. The main issue right now is a lack of affordable housing, and whether the new district would help solve this or just deliver more properties out of most people's budgets is still unknown. Why is that? Well, plans for the urban development and infrastructure for Lynetteholm haven't yet been finalised. That 2021 approval by Parliament was only for the construction of its foundations. As for what will go on it and those connections to wider Copenhagen, that's all going through another environmental assessment, which is set to complete in the summer of 2022 after a period of public consultation. All possible environmental impacts, both good and bad, are being looked at, from the potential for new plant and wildlife habitats to any negative effects on soil and water quality. Another challenge is making sure they don't accidentally build over historic artefacts buried in the seabed, which has required working closely with local archaeologists. Overall, if Lynetteholm can deliver on what it promises, then in time, it could become the new district that Copenhagen needs to secure its future in multiple ways. But that's the thing, it's going to take time, lots of time, and a great deal of work to get it done and win over the doubters. They might be happy now, but let's hope that by 2070, when this is finally finished, the people of this great city are still smiling. It's no secret that New York City isn't exactly safe from the effects of climate change. It's a relatively small island packed with hundreds of thousands of buildings, millions of people, and seemingly endless feats of engineering. During heavy rainfall, subway stations and streets frequently fill with water, evidence that the city's infrastructure isn't prepared for what's to come, and it's only going to get worse. And this tiny tip of Manhattan is particularly vulnerable. Now, officials are racing to come up with solutions for the future. Their latest idea? A multi-million-dollar project that consists of building a seawall, flood barriers, and elevating an entire park in Lower Manhattan. But to save the neighbourhood, some of it first has to be destroyed. Take a walk down the west side of Manhattan and you'll eventually pass through Battery Park City, a lush 92-acre community on the southernmost tip of the island. Once home to the Docklands, this area was officially established in the 1960s through land reclamation. By using the excavation material from the World Trade Center construction site being built at the time, workers extended the shoreline into the Hudson River. Today, Battery Park is considered a successful urban renewal project with ample green space, residential buildings and restaurants. But while the neighbourhood has exploded in popularity, the future isn't as hopeful. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy hit New York, causing an unprecedented amount of flooding across the entire city.
Lower Manhattan remains eerily dark and partially underwater.
Homes and critical infrastructure were left destroyed, and millions went without power for days. In the end, the city was left with about $19 billion in damage. Lower Manhattan saw some of the worst devastation and flooding, including parts of Battery Park City. But this won't be the last of it. As the effects of climate change threaten to generate more intense storms and flooding, the city's infrastructure is not exactly prepared for what's to come. According to the National Ocean Service, sea levels are set to rise roughly a foot or 1/4 metre by 2050. During future storms, water could rise to roughly 5 to 7 metres in the Battery Park area. While it may not be noticeable day to day, if we want to combat climate change, it's vital that we build our infrastructure in ways to protect our cities. Seawalls, trees, and even floating cities are just some of the ideas that engineers around the world are coming up with. Here in Battery Park City, there's at least a $220 million plan on the table. That'll protect key areas on the tip of Manhattan, including Wagner Park, 3.5 acres of green space along the waterfront. The park is going to be demolished and raised from just 3 metres above sea level to 6. At the centre of the whole project is this massive new flood wall. Parts of it are going to be buried under the park, while other sections are going to be exposed or topped with glass. Unlike a traditional seawall that would divide the area, the buried wall will allow visitors to access more green space. The exposed section will feature flip-up gates that will lie flat when not in use. And it'll expand to the north towards Tribeca with an additional flood barrier system spanning along the waterfront. The project also includes enhanced drainage with the installation of isolation valves and a tide gate. Over at Pier A Plaza, the area's lowest points, a bi-level landscaped area with tiered seating is going to act as a barrier to incoming waters. Wood seating will allow it to remain submerged for longer periods of time. Workers will also plant trees and build concrete structures resistant to saltwater. It'll all help protect the neighbourhoods and the surrounding areas from rising sea levels, storm surges and flooding, specifically during rare 100-year storm events. That could save the city lives, money and properties in the next storm. It all sounds promising, but not everyone's on board with the idea, especially down at Wagner Park. Local advocates have pushed back against these changes for years because they'll reduce green space by 10%, and green space is not exactly widespread in New York City. In response, authorities have made several changes to the plans, but to many it's still not enough. And they've proposed alternatives like a larger flood wall and flood-proofing existing structures. Still, officials say the elevation is vital for protecting against future storms that could very well threaten to destroy the park. In a city of over 8 million people, it's perhaps no surprise that so many want to have a voice on future changes, especially when the impact of climate change is now really making itself felt. Saving Battery Park is just one part of a larger plan to fight climate change across this city. Eventually, these projects will connect as part of the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Project along the East River waterfront. This includes more flood barriers and the reconstruction of East River Park. As sea levels continue to rise and as flooding gets more intense, it's important for authorities to get plans like this right the first time, or risk causing irreversible damage to their cities. As the old saying goes, everything's bigger in Texas. Cars, food, hats, land, you name it. The same applies to construction. When a new stadium or piece of infrastructure gets announced here, you just know it's going to take up loads of space and cost huge amounts of cash. Now, there's another massive project in the works that follows the same formula, but this one tackles an issue you might not associate with the Lone Star State. America's oil and gas capital is investing billions to protect one of its key regions against a threat that's becoming more severe thanks to climate change. That's right, with extreme weather now increasingly common and one disaster fresh in the memory, Texas is defending its coastline in the only way it knows how: by going big. Very big. If you still need convincing that Texas has an obsession with size, then you only need to visit one of its cities. Austin, Dallas, Houston, they're all pretty massive, but there's one city here that was once bigger than all of them, and there's a chance you've never even heard of it. This is Galveston, a coastal resort which became the largest city in Texas during the 19th century. Why? Well, because it was home to one of America's major ports, so a lot of money and trade used to flow right through here. As the city and local economy began to prosper, it became clear that a new shipping channel between Galveston and nearby Houston was needed. That meant a lot of heavy dredging and the construction of 2 jetties and a dike to prevent sediment and silt from entering the channel. But even when these protective structures were finished in the late 1890s, Galveston's position on a long, skinny island left it wide open to natural disasters. And that's just what happened in 1900, when one of the worst hurricanes in US history hit the city, killing thousands. Although no one around here will remember that particular tragedy, millions won't have forgotten the one that occurred over a century later.
The seawalls protecting Galveston Island easily breached by surging waves.
In 2008, Hurricane Ike battered southeast Texas with winds of over 100 miles per hour, causing dozens of deaths and almost $30 billion worth of damage, with Galveston taking the full force. The highest storm surge in almost 100 years was recorded, spreading over 15 miles inland, with 34 counties declaring disaster areas. Once the aftermath had died down, attention turned to how this sort of catastrophe could be prevented in the future. Considering the scale of the destruction, it would have to be something substantial. It needed to be done Texas style. So, what is this massive project exactly? Well, it's nicknamed the Ike Dike, and it's part of a wider scheme to give hundreds of miles of Texas coastline much better protection in the event of another disaster. But it comes at a price, costing as much as $31 billion. Around half that figure has been set aside for the dike itself, which is much more than just a simple seawall. The plan is to build a gigantic series of gates and barriers, as well as man-made beaches and dunes stretching across the whole of Galveston Island and the Bolivar Peninsula. At the centre of it all is the most challenging part of the project, a storm surge barrier system made up of several huge gates which will span the near 2-mile gap at the entrance to Galveston Bay. A pair of 200-metre navigation gates will be installed across 3 artificial islands, leaving channels in between for ships to pass in and out. Between these new islands and the shorelines, a set of vertical lift gates will also be put in. Now, most of the time these gates will be left open, allowing the bay to operate as normal, but in the event of another storm surge or a hurricane, they'll all close and form a giant seal against the Gulf of Mexico. It's not too dissimilar to the huge pop-up gates built to protect Venice. And if you're from another European country, you might think those giant swinging gates look a bit familiar. Yes, the team from Texas A&M University that masterminded it were inspired by the Dutch and their system used to protect Rotterdam. In fact, the overall plan to build a new coastal spine for the region is straight out of the Netherlands playbook. As well as the gate system, there will be miles of man-made beaches and dunes, improvements to the existing seawall in Galveston, and restoration of damaged ecosystems. Finally, to protect the city itself, a ring barrier is going to be built. This will include flood walls, highway and railroad gates, and a new drainage system with pump stations. That'll allow water to be moved from inside the barrier back out into the bay. There's a lot to it, which is why it's going to take a long time to actually deliver. The main gate system alone is expected to take around 18 years to complete. A lot of work has already gone in. It required a 6-year, multi-million-dollar comprehensive study to come up with the plan. That was carried out by the US Army Corps of Engineers in partnership with the Texas General Land Office, which is run by a man called George Bush. No, not that one. We're talking George P. Bush, W's nephew, and the current Texas Land Commissioner. The result of the study all sounds very impressive, but there are still obstacles to overcome before work can begin. Ike is just one part of the new Water Resources Development Act, which is now working its way through the US government, and it includes several other projects. Although approval of the act has been given by Congress, there are still a few details to be agreed before the legislation is signed off by the President. The question of funding for the projects has still not been fully answered either. It's predicted that the money will be split in a similar way to other projects of this type, roughly 65% from federal and the other 35% coming from local budgets. That would mean the state of Texas coughing up around $10 billion US. But that's not expected to be a major issue because this enormous scheme will not just protect the people of Galveston and their properties. There are also hundreds of petrochemical facilities in the Houston-Galveston area, including some of the largest oil refineries in the whole of the US. Because it would give added security to an area that's of critical economic importance and it has the backing of Texan politicians, there's confidence the funds can be raised. Ike is shaping up to be one of the biggest and most critical of the many big construction projects that the US is set to embark on. While you could argue that every scheme being put forward to improve America's infrastructure is important, the need for a project like this is obvious when you look at the damage that was done without it. 2008 was yet more proof that even the world's richest economy is still vulnerable to the wrath of nature when not properly prepared. The hope now is that when the next big storm hits, Texas will be ready. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more about where construction is headed, make sure you're subscribed to tomorrow's build.